Alright, me. It is the middle of July, and I came back up to Indiana to grab the rest of my things. And while I was here, I brought a book with me, and that would be Lombardi and Me, written by Paul Hornung and Billy Reed. Paul Hornung, who was the star halfback for the Green Bay Packers of the Vince Lombardi era, wrote 3 books, right? He wrote one that was about his time being single while playing professional football, and I think that was written during his time playing. And then he wrote 2 more books. One was an autobiography, and this was the last one. And this book is focused on yes, cat, hello. This book is focused on the different relationships that people had with Vince Lombardi, right? And the reason Paul Hornung wrote this, as discussed, is that because Vince Lombardi went so quickly from becoming this massive figurehead that represented the complete and absolute historic Green Bay Packers, to then helping turn around the Washington team in one season and bring them to a winning record, and then would die a year later as a result of cancer, right? And so there's this mystique about Vince Lombardi, right? And Paul Hornung really wanted to highlight that it's not about this mystique, but it's that Vince Lombardi was much more than just a pencil pusher coach, right? One of the things that gets brought up a lot is Vince Lombardi's personal relationships with all of these people, right? And about how he made individual connections with each one of them, right? Lombardi and Me covers 18 different people, 19 if you include Paul Hornung's part, and it's just really a deep dive on those relationships, right? And a lot of it is summary portions, right? With then 1 or 2 anecdotes about specific instances with Vince Lombardi, but right, it's still very interesting. Kind of dive into it, because it's one of those things, right, where Vince Lombardi Jr. Touches on this, right? But it's one of those things of like Vince Lombardi Jr. has made a career out of being a public speaker and a motivational speaker, right? Partially because of his name, right? But then also because of this, what has been passed down to him by his father, right? And that really falls into ideas of discipline and putting, the greater good above you, right? That stems from Vince Lombardi's time in the military. Vince Lombardi grew up as I don't remember if he was first generation born or if he was a child when he immigrated, but grew up in Hell's Kitchen in New York, went to school in New York, and then went and worked at things like West Point and worked with like General Douglas MacArthur, right? I think it's a Douglas MacArthur, but right, and so there's this very heavy sense of discipline that exists within the Lombardi mindset, right? But then the second portion of it, right, and the portion that it often gets ignored, right, because it's not as sexy, right? If you're in a management thing, right, it's very easy to instill discipline and instill this intimidation that Vince Lombardi put in, right? It's not really that hard to do. But the second portion of it is that Vince Lombardi was actually a very sensitive person, right? And he knew where to draw the line with a lot of people, and he very rarely got upset when players or people below him confronted him about what he was doing, right? The portions in which, right, that Vince Lombardi gets mad at, as discussed in this book, that are not football related, right? He gets very upset when things don't when you don't do your assignment on the football field, right? But the other portion of it is not sacrificing for the betterment of the team, right? You know, and right, not forcing, but strongly encouraging players to play hurt, right? Or to accept less payment because, you know, they're in Green Bay and they're at a position that doesn't get a lot of attention, right? And things of that nature, right? And so, you know, it is in one way, it's a very admirable style of leadership, right? It's one to take into something like teaching, right? Of where, like, as also discussed in a lot of it, right, is that it's not that Vince Lombardi just simply had the greatest players, right? Even though a lot of these players would eventually end up in the National Football Hall of Fame, right? It's not that these were just naturally the greatest players that he had that were around, but rather that he was able to take a lot of very good players, right, and light a fire underneath them to get them to that next level, right? And that was through building those very personal relationships, but also learning how to motivate, right? And that certainly that's something that's admirable as someone who's going into education, right? Because, you know, I recognize that, and hopefully all people recognize that not every student is this perfect A+ student, right? You know, I'm still a very firm believer that simply just because a student has shown up and has turned something in does not immediately grant them an A just for doing that, right? And so it's about pushing to go further beyond what is initially expected out of themselves, right? However, the other portion of this is looking at this from a, you know, consumer to, you know, worker mindset of the, I don't want to say cannibalistic, but rather the, taking advantage of worker surplus to then force players and force people to work beyond what should be expected of them in a reasonable capacity, right? And, you know, that's another thing that I think is, like, people take away from and use as part of, like, management and things like that, right? But that shouldn't be what we take away from this, right? Yes, it is great that Vince Lombardi's motivation and ability was so great that, you know, players wanted to go well above and beyond what they should allow themselves to do, right? You know, and unfortunately, in certain cases, right, it caused long-term effects, right, and caused people to lose their lives early, right? And it's a balance that has to be created, right? Because although it is great that you can, as a person, motivate people to want to run through a wall for you, right, no matter what, you also, as the leader, have to be willing to draw the line of, you need to stop, right? And I think that's a hard thing, right? Because, right, in a society that is so hyper focused on productivity and what do you create and what do you make, you know, whether, especially like financially, right? We have to be willing to say, you need to stop, right? You are going above and beyond what any reasonable person should. And at this point, you are hurting yourself and hurting others more than you are helping yourself, right? And it's unfortunately, right, if we look at the bigger picture of things, right? And we apply this logic, right? We can see this very much financially, right? In all of the bubbles that we have created within markets or within capital gains, right? Of where there's so much expectation put into, we need to continue building, we need to continue, we need to continue, we need to build more wealth, right? That we never stop to look at as the people doing it and saying, is this actually beneficial, right? Or are we just doing this just to say that we've done and built more, right? You know, so that's that. That's Lombardi and me, and some financial talk. But yeah, overall, I mean, it's a solid book. It's nothing special, right? But it's certainly very, very good read if you enjoy looking at some like kind of motivational stuff and looking at leadership stuff. But yeah.